following is a special presentation of Costas Tonight, presented by Chevrolet.
The Dallas Cowboys coming out onto the field.
They are the NFL's lightning rod, exalted by some, envied and disliked by others. In pure dollar terms, the league's most valuable franchise, the one known as America's team.
How about them Cowboys? Yeah!
For a league that has no presence in Los Angeles, the Dallas Cowboys are as close to Hollywood as it gets. But half a century ago, for the Cowboys of 1963, it was fear, not football, that was on their minds.
Everybody was very afraid because people were really mad.
You could see the anger toward us, just being from Dallas.
You were naturally kind of looking around saying, where could somebody be that might shoot you?
Go home, Dallas. Killers, murderers.
I would be the first guy that would run out there. And everyone kept saying, oh, well, it's nice knowing you. I didn't think it was too funny.
I felt fear that something could happen again, just like it happened in Dallas, Texas.
"50 years ago this month, President John F. Kennedy was assassinated here in Dallas's Dealey Plaza. Like the rest of the nation, the players, coaches, and staff of the Dallas Cowboys were affected by the traumatic event. But as symbols of the city where the president was murdered, the Cowboys soon found some of the nation's anger directed toward them. Over the next half hour, we're going to tell the story of the Kennedy assassination from a very different vantage point, through the eyes of the 1963 Dallas Cowboys, who played and practiced just a few miles from here. Afterwards, I'll talk with Cowboys Hall of Famer Roger Staubach, who in November of 1963 was quarterback of the Navy midshipmen. He has his own story to tell about that weekend a half century ago. So now we head back in time to an age when the Dallas Cowboys were anything but America's team.
Though the Cowboys of today are known for their flash and grandeur, their beginnings were more humble, born as an NFL expansion team in 1960.
We weren't a very good team. We started with players that probably you wouldn't want on your team, and we had to build from scratch.
We formed our team with 3 players from all the existing teams. So we got 33, as Coach Landry told me when he interviewed me, a bunch of reprobates and misfits.
By 1963, the team was still struggling to win games.
Here's the handoff to Big Jimmy Brown. Finds a small opening, makes a bigger one. Still going across the 35 with the 40s in the open across the 50.
But under 39-year-old head coach Tom Landry, the Cowboys were accumulating talented young players like quarterback Don Meredith and linebacker Leroy Jordan, both future Pro Bowl selections, as well as future Hall of Fame defensive tackle Bob Lilly.
The Cowboys were not good at all, and think, well, maybe I made the wrong decision in coming with the Cowboys.
We were not a good team, but we had the nucleus in 1963 to come along and build some great teams out of the players that they had drafted over the previous years.
10 games into the 1963 season, the Cowboys' record stood at 3-7. But it was with an air of excitement that the team prepared for its Week 11 matchup with the Cleveland Browns. President John F. Kennedy would be visiting Dallas that Friday.
First president I voted for was John F. Kennedy. He was a real hero in my generation.
Kennedy had been elected president the same year the Cowboys were born, 1960, winning the White House with the narrowest popular vote margin in modern history.
Barack Obama once said when he was campaigning in 2008 that, yes, he would look different from the other presidents who had gone before, and the same was true of John Kennedy.
Kennedy was the youngest president ever elected, and the first Catholic president. He had a beautiful wife and young children, a famous family that loved sailing and touch football.
President Kennedy captured, I think, the imagination of young people, especially a lot of us guys that were 22, 23 years old.
And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country.
Well, I had met President Kennedy at the Orange Bowl in 1963 in January.
With 75,000 spectators on hand, President Kennedy arrives by helicopter, honored guest of the Orange Bowl committee.
Got to go up and toss the coin for the opening kickoff.
Alabama's captain yells tails as the president flips the coin.
Actually won the coin toss and got the silver dollar as a souvenir.
That spring, Kennedy faced a civil rights crisis in Leroy Jordan's home state of Alabama when police in Birmingham confronted peaceful demonstrators with brute force. And then when Governor George Wallace stood in the doorway to prevent 2 African-American students from enrolling at the University of Alabama. Kennedy activated the National Guard to protect them, allowing the school to become integrated.
James Hood is the first of his race to become a University of Alabama student.
Kennedy represented all the hope that we had bottled up in us. We thought finally we have someone in high places.
As a college sophomore at Johnson C. Smith University in Charlotte, North Carolina, Pettis Norman participated in the sit-in movement that helped desegregate lunch counters in the South. 2 years later, in 1962, he joined the Cowboys and found his new home city unwelcoming.
I had this discomfort about Dallas. I don't know of any blacks that were working in downtown stores, for example. To get a cab, we had to ride in black cabs. White cab driver would not pick us up.
Dallas made black players from visiting NFL teams feel uncomfortable as well, like John Wooten of the Cleveland Browns.
When we would come in to play the Cowboys, we couldn't stay downtown, which is what we were used to in most cities. Couldn't go to the movies because of Dallas's being the segregated place that it was.
The night the University of Alabama was desegregated in June of 1963, Kennedy gave one of his most significant speeches, an Oval Office address on the subject of civil rights.
I am therefore asking the Congress to enact legislation giving all Americans the right to be served in facilities which are open to the public: hotels, restaurants, theaters, retail stores, and similar establishments.
5 months later, the week of Kennedy's arrival in Dallas, flyers appeared in the city accusing the president of treason.
Dallas was just about the epicenter of the radical right in the fall of 1963. These people hated John Kennedy because he was for civil rights. They felt that he had let the nation down in not going through with an invasion of Cuba and then letting the Berlin Wall go up unchallenged.
The mood in Dallas at that time was a little scary. There was hatred for Kennedy. And then you know what happened with the UN ambassador, Adlai Stevenson. He was booed off the stage and almost attacked, hit with a sign, spat upon.
And he said, are these human beings or are these animals? He felt it was so bad. And he sent a message to the president saying, I don't think you should go to Dallas next month. I think it's too dangerous.
But this is a very dangerous and uncertain world.
On Friday morning, November 22nd, as President Kennedy addressed the Chamber of Commerce in Fort Worth, Texas, the Cowboys were at practice, preparing for Sunday's game against the Cleveland Browns.
Well, I was taping an ankle on one of the players. In the background, somebody said, I wonder who's going to take a pot shot at Kennedy today because of what happened with Adlai Stevenson.
There's Mrs. Kennedy, and the crowd yells, and the President of the United States. This is great for the people and makes the eggshells even thinner for the Secret Service, whose job it is to guard the man.
We were on the practice field, and the question became, what if some nut were to shoot the president? I mean, just thinking it would just be so far-fetched.
And here is the President of the United States, and what a crowd, what a tremendous welcome he's getting now.
On the afternoon of Friday, November 22nd, 1963, President Kennedy's motorcade reached Dealey Plaza in downtown Dallas at 12:29 p.m.
I remember everybody exuberant, cheering, wild, and then all of a sudden, a shot.
excuse the fact that I'm out of breath, but about 10 or 15 minutes ago, a tragic thing, from all indications at this point, has happened in the city of Dallas.
All of a sudden, there was this ungodly amount of sirens. And somebody said, boy, there must have been a terrible accident for that much to be going on.
This is NBC News. Here is Peter Hackis in Washington.
President Kennedy has been shot.
As we were getting back in a huddle, one of the guys said that he had heard from someone on the sidelines that the president had been shot.
As of now, there is no final official report on his condition.
I said, I better go out and inform Coach Landry about this. I said, Coach, some tragic event has occurred downtown Dallas. And he looked at me kind of strange, and he said, what are you talking about? I said, Coach, someone shot President Kennedy.
Mrs. Kennedy was weeping and trying to hold up her husband's head when reporters reached the car.
He looked at me in disbelief, and I think actually his face became a little ashen at the time, and he said, you said what?
The president's condition is serious and uncertain.
Coach Landry called us all together, and he said the president's been shot, the governor's been shot, they're both in the hospital, and they were both alive. So we're going to continue to practice until we hear something further.
He was carried into the hospital.
Unconscious and bleeding.
Unconscious and bleeding.
We simply just stood there in total disbelief. I mean, every player just could not believe.
And last rites of the church have just been administered.
We all kind of were in a daze, quite honestly. I mean, you just couldn't believe that the president had been shot.
White House Press Secretary Malcolm Kilduff has just announced that President Kennedy died at approximately 1 o'clock Central Standard Time, which is about 35 minutes ago.
It seemed like life stopped. We were not football players anymore. We were people there trying to figure out what in the world has happened.
When something like that takes place, it's like 9/11. You know, everything shuts down. You don't do the normal.
Like most Americans, the Dallas Cowboys went home that Friday to watch the unfolding events on television.
Behind the casket is Mrs. Jacqueline Kennedy. To her right is her brother-in-law, the Attorney General, Robert Kennedy.
The nation came to a halt. Stores closed. Broadway went dark. Weddings were postponed. But what about the National Football League?
We as players had already thought they're not going to play this game. We should not be going out there talking about winning and losing and rejoicing.
We did not want to go play football. We did not want to practice football. I think everybody wanted to grieve.
Many sporting events scheduled for the day and for this weekend have been postponed or canceled.
Among the cancellations were the wide swath of college football games across the country and the entire schedule of the upstart American Football League. But as the nation grieved, in New York, there had been no word from the NFL about its games. The league's 37-year-old commissioner, Pete Rozelle, was unsure of what to do and solicited a variety of opinions, including that of Cowboys general manager Tex Schramm.
Commissioner Rozelle did discuss it with me. I thought it was appropriate that we played the game. Had we been playing the game in Dallas, I might have had a different opinion of it.
Now chairman of the Pittsburgh Steelers, Dan Rooney was the team's vice president in 1963, and he also spoke to Rozelle in the aftermath of the assassination.
I called him and said, this is really a bad situation. This is terrible. And I said to him that I think you have to cancel the games.
Rozelle also called his friend Pierre Salinger, the White House press secretary, to ask Salinger's opinion.
He said that Pierre felt that Jack would have thought that we should play and that he would have wanted it that way, actually for the nation.
Salinger's advice would prove to be critical to the commissioner's decision. The games would go on.
I thought that the game would be called off and was shocked and was a little angry, really, when I found out the game was going to be played.
You are looking at the casket which contains the remains of the late President John Fitzgerald Kennedy.
On Saturday morning, November 23rd, Americans woke to images of their murdered president lying in repose in the East Room of the White House. But the Cowboys had little time to grieve. They gathered at Love Field, where 24 hours earlier, Air Force One had arrived carrying President John F. Kennedy, only to leave carrying his successor, Lyndon Johnson, and the slain president's body back to Washington. Now, the Cowboys were headed to Cleveland, where they discovered that, to many people around the country, the city of Dallas and anything that represented it was being held liable for the tragedy.
When your president has just been shot in cold blood, you know that the world's a little crazy.
Kay Collier McLaughlin, the daughter of Browns head coach Blanton Collier, remembers the phone calls that came into owner Art Modell's office that weekend.
They received death threats saying that if Dallas was allowed to come and the game was played, that the coaches would be shot when they walked on the field. That was pretty scary stuff.
And we got to the hotel. They said, get off the bus, don't linger around, get in to the lobby and stay there.
Everybody was told, go out and have dinner if you want, but don't say you're from Dallas.
The continuing grief is evident across the United States. Millions of Americans have halted their normal activities to mourn their president.
Among the millions changing their plans was a Dallas strip club owner named Jack Ruby. In Saturday's Dallas Morning News, Ruby had placed a small ad announcing that for the rest of the weekend, out of respect for the president, he was closing his Carousel Club, a place where some Cowboys had come to know him.
He was really obnoxious. I mean, he just kept pestering us and pestering us and pestering us. From my perspective, he was not a normal guy. He was certainly not someone I'd want to be around.
On Sunday morning, Browns offensive lineman John Wooten and his roommate Jim Brown were in the downtown Cleveland hotel where the team stayed before home games. They were watching on television as Lee Harvey Oswald, the president's accused assassin, was being transferred from police headquarters to the county jail.
Oswald has been held here under maximum security. There apparently have been some indications that his life might be endangered during this trip to the Dallas County Jail. Utmost security precautions have been taken.
What's going on in Dallas? We're watching everything, listening to everything we could hear. And they're bringing Oswald out.
There is Lee Oswald. He's been shot. He's been shot. Lee Oswald has been shot.
And here, all of a sudden, Ruby comes and shoots him. And we're sitting right there looking at it.
There's a man with a gun. It's absolute panic here in the basement of Dallas Police Headquarters.
So all of this is going on before the game, right?
Here he comes. Here's Oswald again. He is now lying very pale on the stretcher. He's being put into the ambulance.
News that Oswald had been shot reached the Cowboys during a team meeting.
The man who fired the shot was hustled out of view. He was later identified as Jack Ruby.
Somebody came in the locker room and said, Oswald's been shot. And they said, by who? And they said, Jack Ruby. Jack Ruby. Oh, Jack Ruby. That Jack Ruby? Well, gee willikers, we've been in Ruby's bar, you know, before.
Shortly after 1 p.m., a caisson bearing the casket of President Kennedy moved down Pennsylvania Avenue from the White House to the Capitol. Meanwhile, in Cleveland, as fans began filing into Municipal Stadium, the Cowboys made their final preparations reluctantly.
I felt totally lethargic in terms of how I wanted to approach this game, and I can't believe it. And I was just the opposite kind of football player.
You got your game face on by Sunday. That means a chip on your shoulder. And I didn't have a chip on my shoulder that day, I can tell you that. And I didn't have my game face on.
Fearing anti-Dallas sentiment among the fans, Browns owner Art Modell took an unusual precaution in the form of specific instructions to public address announcer Johnny Holliday.
Mr. Modell said, it may be difficult, but I don't want you to use the word Dallas at all throughout the game. He said, I think there's so much anger directed toward Dallas. Let's just use Cowboys the entire game.
It seemed there were armed guards everywhere. Kind of the feeling that we got after 9/11, when every time you turned around there was a soldier with a gun. It was that kind of feeling walking in, that maybe these people were serious. Nobody knew.
This is the old Scotsman Gordon McClendon in Cleveland, Ohio. Here at Municipal Stadium, a crowd of 40,000 is in a deep hush.
On November 24th, 1963, the crowd was unusually small for a Browns home game. But it was a crowd on edge. And just before kickoff at 2 p.m. Eastern, it was time for the Cowboys to take the field. No one knew how the fans would react, least of all, the players from Dallas.
I would be the first guy that would run out there. And everyone kept saying, "Oh, well, it's nice knowing you." And, I didn't think it was too funny.
Different things at different times were being shouted out by the crowd.
It was killers,
assassin,
murderers,
Kennedy killer.
It was kind of scary.
Normal game, you introduce each player, they come out under the goalpost and go out to midfield. We just started the game with no introductions at all. Kickoff, and that was it.
Bottles were thrown down toward our bench. Nothing hit me, but they were throwing some things at us, and they told us to wear our parkas and our helmets at all times.
You were also suspicious, in the back of your mind, somebody could shoot. So when you went out on the field, you were naturally kind of looking around.
People were really mad, and they blamed it on the city.
Even some of the Cleveland players shared their fans' animosity toward the visiting team's hometown.
This city, Dallas, has killed our president. That was a feeling that we had. We wanted to get out of Dallas.
Hard to believe a football game where transistor radios are all tuned throughout the stands to some other event entirely.
The Cleveland fans were listening for news of Oswald's fate back in Dallas. And during the first quarter, word came from Parkland Hospital.
Mr. Oswald died at 1:07 our time in the operating room of the gunshot wound.
The only thing I could think about during the whole game was, I'm ready to get out of here. I'm ready to get on the airplane and go back home and see what all's going on.
Meanwhile, in Washington, D.C., Americans had begun filing into the rotunda of the Capitol to pay their respects to the late president.
If it had been possible and we'd have been close to Washington, D.C., that's what I would have liked to have been doing that day.
Clearly distracted, both teams played poorly, combining for 9 turnovers. Even the Browns' future Hall of Fame running back Jim Brown lost a rare fumble.
I don't remember anything that took place in the game, whether we won or lost. I just remember this crowd was just so hostile. It was kind of frightening.
For those of you who have interest in the world of sports, at this time, the final score was Cleveland 27, Dallas 17.
We beat the Cowboys that Sunday. The Cowboys did not beat us, and that was not going to happen. They were not going to beat us.
They told us, get your showers, and we're going to get on that plane, and we're going to get out of here. And you knew why.
I think it was the worst event I've ever been in. We could have quit our season then, would have been fine with me.
I was just glad when the game was over. And I just wanted to get away, get back to my family. But then I was coming back to Dallas.
On Monday, November 25th, the day of President Kennedy's funeral, the Cowboys were left to reflect on whether it was right to even take the field in Cleveland.
The President of the United States has been killed. Let's take this moment to think through this thing. We don't have to play this game. We can reschedule later on if we have to.
I talked to a couple of guys on the other team after the ball game was over, and they said, we should have just walked off. We should not have played it, period. What could they have done to us?
For his part, NFL Commissioner Pete Rozelle would later call the decision to play the games that weekend his greatest regret in his 29 years on the job.
Rozelle has said on many occasions that if he had to do his whole career over again as commissioner, that the one thing he would like to change would be his decision on playing the games on the Kennedy assassination weekend.
Everywhere we went for the next couple of years, people booed us when we ran out on the field.
We were the team from Dallas, Texas. We were connected with killing the President of the United States.
It affected our team. Didn't want to hear the booing or the words killers or assassins or whatever they were calling us.
What the Cowboys had to go through was unfair to them. We knew Lily and Leroy and all those guys are good people. And that was a burden that they probably shouldn't have to wear.
On the field, the Cowboys would not have a winning season until 1966. But on Thanksgiving of that year, 3 years to the day after the post-assassination game in Cleveland, Dallas beat the mighty Browns at the Cotton Bowl before a national television audience.
That Cleveland game was a turning point for us, gaining respect back from the other teams as well as the other cities that we were playing in.
We started getting relief from the assassination. We played our way out of our grief and had become a much better football team that year.
When Dallas started winning, that was a transitional thing for this whole city. And it began to wipe away a lot of the negative things that people felt about Dallas.
The Cowboys would go to the NFL championship game in 1966 and 67, narrowly losing both to Vince Lombardi's Green Bay Packers. In the 1970s, they appeared in 5 Super Bowls and won 2 of them. Football fans were drawn to their whole aura, their explosive offense, their innovative coach, and of course, their cheerleaders. After bearing a measure of the nation's anger for a crime that took place in their city, the Dallas Cowboys had become a phenomenon, America's team.
The assassination of John Kennedy, we were known worldwide as a city of hate. As we started to win, we changed that. People focused their attention on football and on our winning, and we became America's team.
I'm proud of my buddies that were there when I was there. We overcame this real tragedy of the president being assassinated in Dallas.
And here is the President of the United States. And what a crowd, what a tremendous welcome he's getting now.
50 years ago, wow, it doesn't seem possible.
It just stays vivid in your mind, maybe forever.
Those of us old enough to recall will never forget where we were the exact moment we heard the president had been shot. But for many members of the 1963 Dallas Cowboys, that moment was only the beginning of the impact they felt. Future Cowboys Hall of Famer Roger Staubach was still at Navy in November of 1963. He'd be drafted the following year by the Cowboys, and he would later play a crucial role in changing the city of Dallas's image in the 1970s. He also has his own recollections of the assassination, and when we return, he'll share them in a conversation. November of 1963, when President Kennedy made his fateful trip to Dallas, the future Cowboys Hall of Fame quarterback Roger Staubach was still a 21-year-old junior at the Naval Academy, and in the midst of a season that would earn him the Heisman Trophy. The biggest game of the year, the Army-Navy game, was scheduled for Saturday, November 30th. But then, just 8 days before, as Staubach and so many others will never forget, everything changed. Just about all of us old enough to remember recall vividly every detail of where we were when we heard that President Kennedy had been shot. Where were you?
Well, I was at the Naval Academy in my room getting ready to go to my thermodynamics class, and ironically, they had just kind of delivered my the cover of Life magazine. I'm on the cover of, and people in the hall were talking about that morning, and that afternoon I heard in the hallway, the president's been shot, and people were yelling up and down the hallway, and so I was getting ready to go to class, walk down Stribling Walk into into our classroom, and our teacher there mentioned that the president's been shot and it doesn't look good. He's probably not going to make it. We basically went back to Brancott Hall. By the time I got back there, we found out he was actually dead, and then we had a memorial service at the academy because he was our commander-in-chief, and it kind of disrupted the whole football program too, because we were getting ready a week from that Saturday we were supposed to play in the Army-Navy game.
The game was postponed and eventually played on December 7th on Pearl Harbor Day.
Right. We went to the locker room that afternoon and the next morning that they still didn't know, that they thought the game could be postponed forever. I mean, you know, just really canceled. And so then it came back that the Kennedy family really wanted it to be played, so it was played another week later. So we really had a great Army-Navy game, very emotional game, and it was played on behalf of the Kennedy family, and especially John F. Kennedy.
The Army-Navy game still matters, but then it was a big deal nationally. It was one of the big events on the sports calendar. And the president, who was a Navy man, attended the Army-Navy game. So you had met him, right?
In the '62 Army-Navy game, I was more nervous before any game I've ever played in. I'll never forget the night before that game. I was starting. In the year before, I was a plebe, and you couldn't play any varsity football till you were a sophomore at that time. And so I was starting that game, and I was a nervous wreck. I couldn't sleep. I mean, your adrenaline's going. So the next day I get up and go out on the field. The President of the United States is there, and it was really a heck of an Army-Navy game, and we ended up winning, and the President came to our locker room, and we had a chance to meet him a couple of times, and he was a Navy guy, and people, it's probably an urban legend, but they said when he went from our side to the other side, he said, well, I'd rather stay on the Navy side. Of course, he's commander-in-chief, so I'm sure it's an urban legend, but that's the story we heard. He wanted to stay on our side. He was on our side, yeah.
But in that era, it was such a dramatic thing. You'd be watching on a black and white television, and here was the President of the United States walking across the middle of the field to go from the Navy side to the Army side at halftime.
Yeah, that was his commander-in-chief role, is to make sure he pulled for both sides, but we knew he was on, we knew he was pulling for Navy.
So in 1963, Navy has maybe its best team ever. You go 9-1, you win the Heisman Trophy, you've already been on the cover of Time and Sports Illustrated, and as you mentioned, you were set to be on the cover of Life, and you still have an early edition that most people never saw, right?
Yeah, well, the Life magazine that it really was going out. They pulled them all back, and then they replaced that Life magazine for the president. I mean, it's November 22nd, same 1963, and the president's death really was a, you know, it's puts things in perspective. It was a tragedy. He was a Navy guy, and so the game, though, when it was played even a week later than it was scheduled, it was so emotional. No pep rallies, no bonfires, but everybody kind of let their emotion out in that game, and we ended up winning 21-15, and they had a great quarterback in Rollie Stitchway. He ended up on our 1-yard line, so it was a heck of a emotional period of time at both West Point and the Naval Academy.
The game was memorable for a variety of reasons. One, because of the aftermath of the president's death and all the emotions attached to it. But Army-Navy is always an emotional meeting, and in this case, you're the #2 team in the country, and Army darn near upsets you.
Yeah, they were a really good football team, and Texas was the only undefeated team in the country. We were 9-1, and we had beaten Pittsburgh, who was undefeated, so we moved up to #2. But Army was a good team. They played Texas and played them tough that year, and so the score was 21-7 in the third quarter, and we never got the ball back. I mean, Rollie Stitchway had a long drive, went into the fourth quarter with that drive. They scored, then got the onside kick, and I'm standing on the sidelines with Wayne Harden, our great coach, and he said, you know, when we get the ball back, we're going to have to do this. We can't stop this guy. And I said, hey, Coach, we're not going to get the ball back. Look at the clock. And it was just ticking away. And fortunately, it ended on the 1-yard line, and we won the game. But we were very fortunate to win that game.
They get down right to the goal line. And I recall, you know, as a kid watching this game on a black and white TV, and Stitchway's holding his hands up trying to quiet the crowd, and they don't realize the clock is running, and time runs out before they can snap the ball.
Yeah, the referees actually have the clock stopped, And they went back to the huddle, and they're thinking now that it stopped, that it's going to start when we take the snap, but that isn't the deal. I mean, they just stopped it because of the noise, but then they started it again. And I don't think they were totally aware that it started again. And Tom Lynch was our great captain. He grabbed that football so fast and came running off the field. Yeah, we didn't want to give him one more play. The way that game was going, they had the momentum.
Another footnote to that game, the first time that instant replay was ever used.
Right.
They worked up some tape machine, and Tony Werner was the director, and they played back a Stitchway touchdown run. And Lindsey Nelson, who's calling the game, has to tell people to watch, no, they didn't score again. They haven't scored a second touchdown. This is what you just saw, because it was brand new.
Yeah, Bud Tallman, our PR guy, mentioned, he's a great guy, he mentioned that they were going to be experimenting at the game, and they were wanting to see me scramble or do something, and it didn't work. They tried it a few times, and then Roley had a great play and towards the end of the game, and that one worked. And it really was the first time that they had an instant replay worked on TV, and it was Roley Stitchway, the Army quarterback.
President Kennedy was a knowledgeable sports fan. Did he single you out? Did he speak with you when he came to the locker room? Did he know, well, here's the quarterback?
Not really. He just kind of was good, nice to everybody. And we met him one time when he pulled into, I guess when he had his helicopter, came into Nantucket or that area, because we were at Quonset Point when we did our two-a-days before the season started. And we met him there, and met him when his helicopter landed, and he came and shook our hands, and he said he loved Navy football, and so he didn't single me out. He just came in our locker room, and kind of everybody wanted to take a picture with him. Back then, it's hard. They didn't have their phone cameras there, right? So, but we had some great pictures of him in our locker room.
As great as the game was, what do you remember about the atmosphere before, after, during, because of this earth-shattering event that had happened only a couple of weeks before?
Yeah, it was actually kind of eerie. It was you didn't know what to expect. There was a question mark: do you really have a game? Should it be played? But we delayed it. But then it was really the Kennedy family, we were told, really wanted that game to be played on his behalf. So. And because of not having pep rallies or anything leading, which you usually do for that game, you get all the stuff going on. Mm-hmm. So it was all, I think everybody just kind of waited till the game, and then they let it all out. They let all their emotions out. And it was one heck of a game from the opening kickoff to the end of the game. It was just, everyone, knew. Here it is 50 years later, and we still feel strange when we even think about President Kennedy being shot and killed.
Did you have a sense, even though you weren't part of the Cowboys or the Dallas scene in the early and mid-'60s, did you have a sense that football helped to rehabilitate the city's image? It wasn't fair, but a lot of people associated Dallas and some sort of emotional reaction with the president's death. And there are people who believe that the emergence of the Cowboys as America's team helped to turn that around.
I think it did a lot. I think in that mid-'60s, Meredith really took the team. He got beat around. It was an expansion team, but he and Bob Hayes, and they lit it up. They had some great years and great games, and I think that had a lot to do with looking at Dallas in a different light. And then in the 70s, we were really a good team, and they named us America's team after that 77 Super Bowl. It was, I think Steve Sable did it on the NFL Films. Mm-hmm. Titled a film called America's Team, and Tex Schramm loved that. So I didn't like it, though. But Bill Berge hit me one time on a blitz. He was an Eagle linebacker, and said, well, take that, America's quarterback. So it's nice when you're retired of being a part of America's team. When you're playing, it's kind of an ego thing for the Cowboys. But I think it had a lot to do with how people felt about Dallas. They learned more about Dallas. After 50 years, there's still, Dallas took a hit. It really hasn't totally recovered, but it's recovered quite a bit.
Roger, thanks for all your time. Appreciate it.
My pleasure, Bob.
Thanks a lot. And we're back with some final thoughts after this. Cargo plane. 50 years later, there's still been no truly comparable situation in sports to what the Dallas Cowboys experienced in 1963 in the wake of the assassination of President Kennedy. Just one of many singular aspects of a moment in history that a half-century later still resonates so strongly. It would be 6 years before Roger Staubach joined the Cowboys and helped them become America's team. But in 1963, 2 weeks after the assassination, the Army-Navy game was played. And as Staubach led the midshipmen onto the field, some members of the Kennedy family were actually watching the game. Wrote the late Senator Edward Kennedy, 15 years his brother's junior. It was, of course, a very difficult time, and we really couldn't give the game our full attention. But I do recall that Navy won that year, and my brother would have liked that. John F. Kennedy was 46 when he died 50 years ago this week in Dallas.